Hello and welcome back to the Hear Our Voice podcast. I'm Leon Doherty, Student Governor of Central Bedfordshire College, and today I'm joined by several guests, my peers from Central Bedfordshire College in Dunstable and Barnfield College in Luton. If I could ask my peers to first introduce themselves. So Aisha, don't know if you want to go first?
I'm Aisha.
Thank you. Paul?
Hello, I'm Paul. I'm from Central Bedfordshire College as well, and I'm here to ask questions upon the subject in which Leon mentioned.
Thank you very much. Joshua?
Hello, my name is Joshua Morgan, and I go to Barnfield College, West Herts College, and I study Level 2 Media.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to now introduce our special guests from the VERU Violence and Exploitation Reduction Unit, Lisa Robinson and Roseann Taylor. Lisa, or rather, would you want to start first, whichever one of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Leon. My name's Lisa Robinson. I'm the exploitation lead within the VERU. So as you said, the VERU is the Violence and Exploitation Reduction Unit for Bedfordshire.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Roseann Taylor, and I'm a youth intervention specialist at the Violence and Exploitation Reduction Unit.
Thank you both very much. Today, we're going to be having a conversation around child sexual exploitation, what to do if you suspect someone is being groomed or exploited. I'd like to open up the discussion, first of all, by asking what exactly child exploitation is.
Okay, so when we're talking about child sexual exploitation, what we're talking about is a type of sexual abuse. So predominantly CSE, so child sexual exploitation, comes under the category of sexual abuse of children. So usually it's when a child or young person is exploited by a person that's grooming them and then giving them things. So for example, like gifts, drugs, alcohol, money, and sometimes even includes things like a status or affection or even a purpose. But usually amongst these issues then comes some sort of exchange, which is usually something classed as sexual activity or where the sexual abuse takes place. Often with child sexual exploitation, children and young people are tricked into believing that they're in a loving and consensual relationship, which is obviously where the grooming part comes in. And often they'll trust and understand their abuser and not realise that what's actually happening is that they're being abused. And I think what's really important for me to say is that CSE can happen in person and online. So an abuser will gain a child or a young person's trust to control them through sometimes violence or blackmail before actually moving on to the sexual abuse element. And sometimes this can happen in a really short period of time and doesn't take long at all, especially with regards to online sexual exploitation. Sometimes children and young people will feel that they're being persuaded or forced to send or post sexually explicit images of themselves or film or stream sexual activities, which is obviously classed as sexual abuse, or have sexual conversations online as well. So that's predominantly what child sexual exploitation is.
Thank you very much. There are some very interesting points there. I'd now like to introduce Josh, who I believe has another question to ask.
Yeah, so how common is sexual exploitation among children of different ages?
I think that's a really good question to ask Josh, actually. We currently don't really know exactly how many children, across the UK are experiencing sexual exploitation or other forms of sexual abuse. And that goes the same for us in our local area across Bedfordshire as well. With regards to sexual exploitation and all forms of sexual abuse, it's usually really hidden from any view. So adults in a child or young person's life may not recognise the signs that their child or a young person that they know of is being sexually abused. And often with young people, they're too scared or too ashamed maybe to tell anyone what is happening to them. What I can tell you as well from a national perspective is a recent report came out from the NSPCC about how safe our children are. And what they found is currently rates of police recorded sexual offences against adolescents are actually higher currently than against younger children. And obviously we know from research as well that usually there's a much higher number of children or young people who are being abused from a sexual exploitation element, and often they don't come into contact with children and often into services or local authority areas, for example. So it's a really difficult question to answer because we really don't have the knowledge of exactly how many young people are being sexually exploited, because like I say, many don't disclose at a young age or even into adulthood either. So it's definitely something that needs to be further explored, and we need to try and make it easier for young people to feel like they can make a disclosure if they are being sexually abused.
Did you want to add on that, Roseann?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything that Lisa said. You know, that you know, adolescence, it is a very tricky time for them. But yeah, totally. I mean, I think that Lisa nailed that.
Thank you both. I believe Paul has a question in relation to that.
Yeah, hello. I was going to ask, are any particular children at increased risk, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'd also like to point out when we talk about children that are at risk of child sexual exploitation, it is not just the females. Males are also at high risk of CSE. And also we're seeing a growing trend in young people that come from affluent backgrounds, whose parents are working, have great jobs, they have great, you know, social circles, they have great friends, but sometimes there might be that slight gap that mum and dad are out at work an awful lot, and as Josh rightly said at the beginning of our podcast, you know, they're on social media, and that in itself poses a risk. But you know, these people that exploit young children are looking for children, specifically for children that have vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities could be a mental health issue. They could be coming from adverse childhood experiences. They could have family members that have substance misuse. There could be a child that's being bullied. But you know, the reality is that all children are at risk. You know, there is no specific if you come from this background that you're more at risk of. I think that times have changed, and really, you know, we have to look at it as an aspect of all of our children and young people can be at risk of sexual exploitation.
Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that.
I just wanted to say actually that it was really important that Roseann obviously raised the issue about, you know, this isn't only happening to girls. I mean, we know locally, so from a Bedfordshire perspective, that CSE is happening to boys as well. And I think it's really important that we raise that within this podcast. Last year in Bedfordshire, we did run a campaign called #ItHappensToBoysToo. And I think it's really important that we raise that. We do know that, you know, much less numbers of boys come forward and disclose about any sexual abuse or sexual exploitation. So I think it's really important part of this podcast that, you know, we raise that issue with regards to boys and males in general with regards to making a disclosure.
I completely agree with that, yeah. And from a student sort of perspective, when we study and learn about sort of different types of abuse and exploitation, it's a similar sort of thing. We don't really focus too much on males and boys within this sort of idea of crime and being exploited. So I think that's important that you both raise that. I think Josh had another question to ask you.
So yeah, I actually have two questions. My first question is, why do you think it is that boys are less likely to come out and explain their sexual exploitation?
I can answer part of that, and maybe Lisa can come in. I think that it's difficult for girls and boys to voice what is going on for them. So, you know, I believe that the strength that it takes to speak out on that would not differ from a boy or a girl. But, you know, I think that society in general now assume that it's girls that are being sexually exploited, and they're kind of missing the part that it could be boys as well. So I think it is, and I think somebody's touched on, you know, guilt, shame, and all of those kind of feelings. It's a very difficult thing, especially if they presume it to be something that, you know, is not the done thing. It's a really hard one. Would you agree, Lisa?
Yeah, definitely, Roseann. I agree with everything that you just said there. I think it's so difficult, like you say, for any victims of any sexual offences, I think, you know, to come forward, or any form of sexual abuse. I think often as well in the media with regards to male sexual abuse, it's very differently worded than it is when it's a female victim, especially if it's a male a male victim and a female perpetrator. I think how that's worded in social media and other forms of media with regards to male victims is very, very differently worded than if it was a female victim. And recently, I think there's been a case in the press with regards to a male victim who was 14 or 15 with a female perpetrator. And as I say, the headlines are very different. So I don't think we make it very easy for males to come forward and make that disclosure. And, you know, we have acknowledged that obviously it's very hard for anyone to disclose any sexual abuse. But I don't think we make it as easy for boys as we could. And that's a societal thing as well. And obviously that's something that we're really promoting within the Violence and Exploitation Reduction Unit, that this can happen to anybody, whatever your gender, whatever your age. And we want to try and make it as easy as possible for victims to feel like they can come forward and make a disclosure and get the support that they need.
And Lisa,
yeah,
could I just add on to furthermore to that, you know, sometimes young males don't realise that actually they've been a victim of child sexual exploitation. You know, we have cases that come through VERU, and the young males don't actually realise that when they're being asked by a gang member to deposit drugs in their back passage, they're not actually aware that they've been sexually exploited. That is sexual abuse, you know. So you know, it is about arming young people with the facts and helping them to understand actually what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense of I think it is very much differently worded for boys. I think it's hard that for both genders. Do not get me wrong, but I think it is very much differently worded to boys than it is for girls. But another question I had was, is there any way to really prevent sexual exploitation for younger generations?
I mean, it really is about keeping yourself safe, and by that I mean online and offline. As Lisa rightly said in the very beginning, a lot of exploitation, sexual exploitation, can start online, you know, and that's a gateway in. And I think it takes 6 seconds, in actual fact, to get the attention of the person that they've targeted, you know. So it is really about being aware of like who you're talking to, you know, doing your research on who that is, checking that it's a real profile, and, you know, seeing who their friends are. And, you know, and Lisa and I were speaking earlier, and, you know, sometimes if you don't know who that person is, don't respond to it, you know, because they will move on to somebody else, you know. And there is the obvious things, like if it's you know, girls are going out, when you go out together, make sure that you stick together, you know, don't leave somebody behind because she's met somebody and she's chatting away to them, you know. Go out as a group and stay as a group. The same for young men. Let people know where you're going, you know, even keep the location on your phone, keep that on, so if anything should happen, you know, that people can contact you. I mean, also alcohol, you know, drug uses. We know that young people do this, you know, but if you are going to go out and drink, you know, take your own drink with you. Make sure that you're drinking what you know that belongs to you, not that somebody has given you, you know, and there is that myth around consent. You know, I've heard of cases where young people have been sexually exploited whilst they're either intoxicated or high, and they assume that because, you know, it was okay at the time that nothing had happened to them. And actually the myth is that that is an offence. You know, you cannot legally give consent to something if you are not within your right frame mind. So it really is, you know, about, you know, not going, make sure that you're not in locations where they're dimly lit, you know, check on your friends, you know, keep up to date. Yeah, it really is about a safety planning for yourself, but above all, you know, talk to people. If it feels wrong, it's wrong. You know, trust your gut feeling. If something doesn't quite feel right, run it past, you know, a member of your family, you know, a staff member at college or something that you have a good relationship. But always run things by. But most importantly, you know, listen to your friends, listen to your gut feeling, and just be aware of who you're talking to.
Those are some very good points. And although most of them seem almost as if they're sort of common sense, I feel as if it's sort of underrated how important each one of those things that you just mentioned are to a person's safety. And I think we should obviously take very keen eyes onto that. And just to go back to the previous point we made about boys and girls, I believe that there's almost a sort of stigma around males being exploited and abused. There's almost this toxic masculinity, which perhaps maybe this is just from my experience, but that's sort of almost one aspect that prevents males from, one, realizing they're being exploited, and two, then raising that issue with someone. It's almost as if they were to tell someone they were being abused, they would no longer be seen as this sort of masculine, dominant male individual. But yeah, some very good discussions there. I think Aisha wanted to come in for another question.
I have two questions. I was wondering, how could someone tell if they're being sexually exploited?
Lisa or myself? Sorry, how can could you, sorry, I didn't hear it. Could you
How
run it
can
by
someone
me?
tell if they're being sexually exploited?
It's a
Like
really
all the time.
it's a very difficult one to know, because it's very sophisticated, and there is a grooming process, and I think that when a young person is in that, it's very difficult to pinpoint those things. You know, young people have a saying which is catch feelings. So, you know, if we're looking at from the male to female aspect of it, so a male may come into a female's life and they may portray everything that young lady wants. So it might be, you know, protection, it might be a shoulder to cry on, and it's hitting all of those spots, you know. So it's very hard for a young person, male or female, when they're in that moment to know. But like I said to you, the most important thing is, if it feels wrong, 9 times out of 10 it is wrong. But you know, there will be slight changes, there will be boundary pushing, there will be you befriending, the gifting, the stuff that Lisa spoke about in the very beginning. I mean, it is about trying to take a step back and asking, you know, I have a saying that, you know, a burglar never burgles an empty house. They will always target a house that is full of goodies. So it's about, sometimes, if you're able to take a step back and actually ask, you know, what is being requested of me? What do I have? You know, but it's a really difficult one.
Thank you for answering that question. Aisha, did you have another question?
Yeah, how could we help our friends if we think we are spotting the signs of grooming?
So, I mean, first and foremost, if you believe that your friend is being sexually exploited, is to you know, an adult member in your family, maybe share your concerns with them, take it to a member of staff in your college, or, you know, somebody that you trust with this information, and run that past them, you know. But above all, you know, it is important to share this stuff. But if the person that you believe is being sexually exploited, and they have come to you and they're disclosing this stuff to you, it's really important to listen. And when we listen, is to not be judgmental, because it's a really difficult thing for them to come forward and to say about that, you know. And not to share this information with other people, you know, because, you know, as we pointed out before, there is lots of emotions, there is trauma that's going along with this, there's feelings of guilt, of shame, you know, of all these emotions that are going through, and they just need support to get through this. But like I said, if they've not disclosed it to you, I would suggest that, you know, a family member, you know, a safeguarding at college, if you have a social worker, or you have a key worker, share it with them. But above all, it is very, very important to share this information with adults and professional people, so that safeguarding can be put in place for that person.
And there's so many support services available as well. So it's really good that, you know, if you're trying to support a friend that you think's being groomed or being exploited, that, you know, like, for them to know that there is support out there and there is support available. And like Roseann said, you know, it's about having a trusted person to talk to. And clearly with young people, you know, usually that is going to be another one of your friends that you want to talk to. And that's what, in our experience, that's what we find, that the majority of the time when young people do disclose, it's usually to a friend. You know, over 80% of children and young people, they do try to tell someone that they are being abused. It may not be in those words either. So, you know, I mean, it's very rare that someone will come out and use the words that I am being sexually abused, or I am being sexually exploited, or I am being exploited, because some people don't even know what those words mean. But I think as a friend group or as peers, you've just got to look out for other things that are going on for your friends. So is there like a change in their behaviour? You know, is there something different about a friend? Have they withdrawn or gone into themselves, and they're not, you know, usually how you know them as a friend? And I think, as Roseann said, it's just so important to be there and be kind and listen, know that there's support services and there's people out there that are there to help.
Thank you. Again, there were some very good points made there. Now, we've discussed sort of who we believe may be most vulnerable and looked at the risks to people because of exploitation. But I'd like to now move on to the impact of the exploitation that we have just discussed. So I'll open the discussion with a question: what is psychological impacts of sexual exploitation on youth and children?
Okay, so the psychological impact of any form of child abuse is obviously huge on any child or young person. But with regards to sexual exploitation in person and online, the long-term effects can include struggling with trust and being fearful of forming new relationships and like bonding with other people, because you don't trust what's going to happen. So you're worried about, this has already happened to me, is this going to happen to me again? So that trust is really gone. Sometimes people become really isolated from their family, from friends and support groups. And as I said earlier, you know, that support from your friends group is really important. So isolation is something that you could look out for, you know, for your friends. Are they now isolating themselves? Then there's mental health issues, so things like depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. I mean, in my work over the years with regards to victims or survivors that I've worked with, the CSE, low self-worth is a real sign that someone may be being sexually exploited, and that has a massive impact on how, you know, they can move forward and deal with the trauma that they've been through. Self-harm, again, is another something to look out for and an impact. Maybe failing exams, so they might be someone that's done really well before academically but not doing so well now, or dropping out of education. Roseann talked about drug and alcohol use earlier. So lots of young people that have been through some sort of sexual trauma will often use drugs and alcohol as a way of dealing with that trauma. So we often call that like self-medicating to try and make them feel better. Often again to look out for like exploitation or being exploited into criminal behaviour, or seemingly that they're taking part in criminal behaviour, but that can also be an impact of CSE. Sometimes people may experience homelessness, withdrawing from services that they might have been receiving support from before. So like I say, there's many long-term effects, and obviously those effects, you know, you can work through those, and both Roseann and I have said that there is support services there, you know, to support with dealing with the trauma of what you've been through. And we know how difficult this is as well. So we're not here to say we know that it's easy to make these disclosures and talk through what you've been through, but obviously there is support services available. And sometimes the earlier, so the early trauma work, or working with someone that you trust, or even talking about all of these issues, can have a more positive outcome in the long run.
Thank you. I just want to bring Josh in again.
Yeah, so I know we went over this a little bit earlier. That is sexual. Sorry, forgive me. Sexual exploitation is more common in adults at the moment. I believe you said that. What is the impact? Is the impact different in adolescents?
Well, I think, Josh, what I was saying earlier was that there'd been a recent report, wasn't there, that came out with regards to how there'd been definitely an increase, you know, in sexual exploitation in adolescents. So really the impact of sexual exploitation isn't necessarily different for adolescents. I think when you've been through some sort of trauma, which is obviously what sexual abuse is, it doesn't really matter what age that abuse takes place, because we also know, while we're talking about it, that obviously there is vulnerable adults as well that are at risk of sexual exploitation or being sexually exploited. And as I said earlier, we just know with regards to untreated trauma, this will obviously have a real impact on the rest of that person's life. And that's why we say within our unit that, you know, we have got services to assist that can support, you know, and help people get through this as well. And we also said that there's other services that are available in Bedfordshire. And there's so many reasons, like, for not talking about what is happening. I mean, we've touched upon, you know, the guilt and the feelings that you have when you've been sexually exploited or sexually abused. And a lot of that is from the person that's actually the abuser, you know, making you feel in those sort of ways. So like I say, the impact itself isn't necessarily different, like everything I talked about earlier with regards to the mental health issues and maybe self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. Obviously, adolescents may tend to go down those sort of paths when dealing with different types of trauma. But what I can say as well is that, you know, in the last 5 years, there's been a 57% increase in the amount of recorded offences that include sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. And more than 8,000 offences were committed against 14-year-olds, which did make it the most common age group to report offences. So there's definitely, you know, as you said, Josh, there definitely has been that increase in sexual exploitation of the adolescent age group. And what we need to make sure is that we all respond, you know, to the needs of the young person who's experienced the abuse, so that they're able to access, you know, specialist support that meets their needs and helps them recover. Because that's what we want. We want young people, obviously, to recover from going through this trauma. I mean, obviously, what we really want is to prevent and identify things much earlier, so that we prevent this from happening to young people.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I did have one extra little side question. So is there like a different impact between the genders, between a male or a female being sexually groomed or, well, sexually exploited?
Not usually. The impact with regards to any form of sexual abuse, whatever your gender, is very similar. So again, you know, with regards to mental health issues, the drug and alcohol use, taking part in criminal behaviour. I mean, usually when we talk about child criminal exploitation, for example, people do automatically think males, but a little bit like when we talk about CSE, people automatically think female victims. So no, with regards to the impact on gender, that definitely doesn't, like make a difference. There's still that, chance of experiencing unemployment or dropping out of school, like I said, or failing exams if the person was achieving high before. So no, I don't know if Roseann's got anything to add to that from her experience.
Yeah, I'd love to answer something on that. So, my understanding actually that trauma is trauma. The feelings that a person is left with is the same. The trauma could slightly be different. So as Lisa said, the different types of exploitation. But when we boil it down, that young person has suffered trauma, and the trauma will result in the same feelings of guilt, of shame, of blaming themselves, of a possible criminal life in the future, substance misuse, all of those things, because we can't, for example, if I see a spider and Lisa sees a spider, we've both done the same thing, but our experiences around that are different. So one would be left traumatized and one wouldn't, but her trauma is her trauma. So yeah, I think that we need to remember that it doesn't matter what kind of exploitation that young person is going through in their life. Untreated trauma will result in a lot of the things that Lisa just mentioned.
Thank you. And I have to say, those statistics that you mentioned, Lisa, they're quite eye-opening. They're quite significant figures, that. And that's quite interesting. I just wanted to bring in Paul, who has a similar question to what we're discussing here.
Yeah, on the topic of that long-term impact of this, what would you say isn't so common? What wouldn't you expect to see? What could be the sign of something worse than this?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. You broke up.
Yeah, I couldn't hear that very well either. I did get the long-term impacts, but I didn't quite get the rest.
On the subject of the long-term impact, what would be uncommon to see? What would you not expect to see? What could be the sign of something worse, do you reckon?
I'm not really sure if there is anything that you wouldn't regularly see. I mean, obviously the biggest part would be silence, so which is something that you potentially could see, but you don't hear from somebody, or they don't talk about it at all. Because what we haven't mentioned so far is often many people that have been through some form of child sexual abuse or sexual exploitation will never actually tell anybody. So sometimes there won't be all of the issues that we've talked about, mental health issues or anxiety or depression. Maybe some people will never even pick up on those issues because the person will never ever make that disclosure. I think really the trauma of being a victim of any abuse for some doesn't even end when their abuser isn't around anymore, for example, or goes to prison. Many side effects last for a very long time after. I think the psychological impact of CSE is often much more enduring than the physical pain. And I've heard that from many survivors over the years in my work in this sort of area. For many victims of CSE, the psychological effects last long into adulthood. And that's even, like I say, if they make that disclosure, because we've talked about the mental health issues and maybe the drug and alcohol use and depression. But what we haven't mentioned too much is the shock and the fear, the anxiety that being a victim brings with it, and survival mode of becoming a victim of CSE. I think, I know that we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's really important that people are aware that there is support out there, because that really assists with regards to recovery from CSE. But like I say, not everyone ever makes those disclosures, and we just need to make sure that people that do are really well supported.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess a way you could sum some of that up with by staying silent pretty much says a lot in this situation, and you've got to turn that silence into words somehow.
Most definitely. I think that's so important. So, like I say, so many victims or survivors of this, don't ever say anything. But for you as young people, for friends, for your peers, it's to look out for those sort of signs as well. And for professionals, it's really important for professionals. Just because someone's not saying something, it doesn't mean that something not nice is happening to them. And I think it's really important that everyone is aware of that. And many reports with regards to sexual abuse or CSE are often, it's wrong, but I got used to it, or no one noticed, no one heard. And I did say earlier, that 80% of children and young people do try and disclose, but sometimes it's not necessarily the words that are coming out.
Thank you, Lisa, for that information. Brilliant.
That's great. That was a really good discussion around the impact of sexual exploitation on children there. I just wanted to advance the discussion onto almost the signs of exploitation and what people can do about those signs. So I'd like to invite Josh back to begin the discussion.
Yes. So I actually, so the first one, I actually have two questions. The first question I wanted to ask was, sorry, Leon, that I wanted to backtrack a little bit, is the trauma that young people get from being sexually exploited. Do you think the way they are able to deal with it, is it, or how it happens to them, do you think it's because of upbringings that they have as well, in the sense of if they're exploited from someone that might be a close family member or something, do you think they've been taught not to deal with that, anxiety or depression and things of that nature?
Can I answer a little bit on that, Lisa, and maybe you come in?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, when you give that scenario of it being, a member of the family that they possibly know, I mean, that's a very difficult one for any young person to voice that out, because often, they may feel that they're not believed, or, if they escalate that and they tell a family member or they tell a professional, that even after they've told, they may feel that they're unsafe. It's like, this is my family member. It's, how do I protect myself from that person? So there's a lot of fear, and Lisa already touched earlier on. A lot of this stuff is when somebody is being sexually exploited. One of the major tools that the person who's exploiting them uses is fear-based. If it's an online one, if you don't do what I'm going to ask you to do, then I will distribute these photographs of you. There's so much, it's fear-based. If you tell anybody, I'm going to hurt a family member. And this is a lot for a young person to deal with, for them to be able to comprehend at that moment in time when they are in that trauma. For them, they can't see a way out. So yeah, it's a really difficult one. Wouldn't you agree, Lisa?
Yeah, most definitely. Everything that you've just said, I was just nodding away there, Roseann. I think that's what we haven't mentioned that much, is about the level of violence and threat that comes with CSE as well, that makes people not want to make that disclosure or not mention that. And especially within the question about if it's somebody that's known, and we know that the percentage of victims that do know who their perpetrator or who the offender is obviously extremely high. But Roseann answered that question amazingly. The level of violence that some of the young people that are going through, that we're seeing, in Bedfordshire, is so high, and the threats of violence towards their family members or younger siblings. So in a way, sometimes it's a protective method as well, by not making that disclosure, because they're trying to protect other people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So kind of like, as Leon said earlier, seeing the signs of sexual exploitation. What should someone do if they suspect that they are being sexually exploited?
I could answer a little bit, and then maybe Lisa can come in as well. I mean, you know, as I said before, it's a difficult one for a young person to actually pinpoint that this is going on with them, because it is a very sophisticated grooming process. And we often find, you know, the person is actually exploiting that young person. They themselves don't realize that they're doing it because it's been done to them and it's been quite normalized, you know. But, you know, if that young person does believe that they are a victim or about to be a victim of child sexual exploitation, as Lisa said, you know, there is support out there. You know, there is the NS, oh my God, I've forgotten. Is it the
The
NSCPD?
NSC.
That's it. Sorry, I got all tongue-tied. There's that. There's also, you know, VERU as well. You know, we can support around that. But yeah, it is about having that strength and courage to speak out, to share this with somebody else, you know, and get that support around it. But as I keep saying to you, it's a very difficult one for a young person to actually know sometimes that this is going on for them, you know. And as friends, you know, as your friends, it's important for us, you know, to look out for each other, because sometimes, you know, from an outsider looking in, we can kind of spot things a little bit easier. And it is gently about supporting that person, you know, signposting them to where they need to be, you know, sharing that information with your family member, your school, yeah, all that kind of stuff. Lisa?
Yeah, I agree, Roseann, with what you were saying as well. I think sharing the information is a key element if you've got concerns that someone you know is being sexually exploited. And as Roseann said, apart from the fact that we have got services locally that can offer that support, there is, like Roseann said, the NSPCC, there's Childline that you can call for free confidential advice if you've got concern. I mean, obviously, if you've got concerns about a person that maybe is posing a risk to young people or to children, you can call Crime Stoppers anonymously. And obviously, again, for us in Bedfordshire, we've got Bedfordshire Police who would be very supportive to offer support as well with regards to if you needed information or wanted to share any information. But sharing information and having someone to talk to is two of the key elements, I think, with regards to what to know, what to do if you're concerned that someone is being sexually exploited.
Yes, I agree. I believe that you should, as hard as it can be, you should at least let someone know that you're going through a troubling time, you don't know what to do.
Most definitely. And like we said earlier, many victims don't even realise that they are being exploited. So sometimes they just need to talk that through with someone else. So whether it's a peer, or, you know, we always talk about like a trusted adult or someone trusted that's in your life that you can talk something through. And as Roseann said earlier, if something doesn't feel right, it's usually not right.
Yep, I 100% agree.
Absolutely, that's some great points once again. I'd like to just bring Aisha in. I think she has another question along the same sort of discussion here. Perhaps not.
Sorry. Is it common for children not to even tell their parents that they've been exploited?
Yeah, it's really, really common. And I think we've touched a little bit upon this while we've been talking away. I think, you know, it's really important to remember that every victim of child sexual exploitation copes with their abuse in different ways. And we've already, you know, talked about how it's never easy experience to come to terms with the abuse that's been inflicted on the person. And, you know, some victims have ways of finding coping strategies to deal with what they've been through. And sometimes this includes disclosing or not disclosing the abuse to a trusted person. So, you know, like I said, Roseann spoke earlier about the level of violence that we're seeing, you know, in Bedfordshire and nationally with regards to CSE and why victims will probably not come forward. Many victims find it difficult to talk about their problems or don't know who to talk to, or they may not have someone that they trust enough to listen to them. So it's really common for people or children, you know, not to even tell their parents that they've been abused. Sometimes parents don't find out until much later on in life that their child's been sexually exploited. But, you know, like I say, victims deal with things in different situations, but no victim is any less of a victim for seeming to have coped really well and opened up and moving on from their abuse. And no victim is any less strong than another victim, you know, for this massively impacting psychologically, you know, years after their abuse has taken place. So yes, it is very common, and that's why, you know, when we talked earlier about, you know, what does the picture look like for us locally or even nationally with CSE, and that's why that's really hard, obviously, to answer, because we know that there is so many victims that are hidden that never disclosed. So it's always very difficult to say what does the picture look like for us. But yes, it is very common for anybody not to tell anybody that they've been abused in all forms of abuse, actually.
Thank you. Now, we spoke about this throughout the podcast here today, but I wondered if we could just clarify what exactly it is that makes children vulnerable.
Yeah, so it can be lots of different things, and obviously, I mean, it is there in the world, in the word. Children are vulnerable. Children are innocent. Children are, you know, they're impressionable. They're open to suggestion. You know, and exploiters will target that. You know, they will beeline into the fact that this young child doesn't have the lived experience that maybe somebody who's, you know, slightly older. They don't have, you know, how can I put it, that how to compare, is this situation not right or is it right? And it's a, you know, young people are very impressionable, but like we said in the very beginning and in the first question, there is so many elements that make children and young people vulnerable. And, you know, you've got looked after children, you know, who don't have that social that family network that they can bounce things off. You know, it could be a child that's being bullied that doesn't feel part of, and the exploiter could come in from that angle and, you know, be that, you know, that friend. You know, it could be somebody also, you know, who has who's just experiencing their sexuality, you know, they're questioning, you know, and stuff like that. There is so many elements. It could be a child that comes from a family where there is substance misuse and the parenting skills are not of the greatest, but again, in the same respect, you know, we are seeing young children who are coming from affluent backgrounds with really good parenting setting, and they're still very vulnerable. So, you know, I think the key element is to remember that, you know, children are, you know, they're vulnerable, you know, and exploiters look for vulnerabilities.
That was actually going to be one of like a question I was going to ask. Do you think people, so there are a lot of especially people in our generation, like very confused about their sexuality? Maybe it's because being a different sexuality is more accepted now, but then there's also a trauma maybe that happened in their past with their parent or someone else. So that was actually going to be one of my questions. Is it like, do you find a lot of young sexually exploited children being more confused with their sexuality because of their exploitation?
I wouldn't, you know, if at the beginning of that question you asked, you know, so there is that element of, so a child that is battling with their sexuality already feels that they are not part of, they're unsure on what aspect that they fit in. So that in itself is a risk to that young person, because they're maybe not able to speak with that to their family member, to their parents, to their caregiver, to so on and so forth. So that, again, what Lisa touched on earlier, it is an isolating factor. So they can feel that they're isolated from sharing. So, you know, if somebody comes along and, you know, and they disclose that to them, they can use that as, oh, you know, I don't mind, or, you know, blah, 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 and kind of, you know, that false sense of security. It is again about fitting in, isn't it?
Yes, no, I totally agree. I understand.
Absolutely. Josh, I believe you had another question to ask, unless Lisa, did you want to say something there?
Did you hear me like breathe in like I wanted to say something? I think that's a really good point. And good question, what Josh was mentioning. What I think is worth mentioning as well, that sometimes with perpetrators or people that pose a risk, they will use a young person's sexuality against them as well. And I think it's really important, you know, to raise that, because sometimes what they'll do is they'll say things like, oh, well, people won't believe you anyway because you are battling with your sexuality, or, you know, you don't know what your sexuality is. So perpetrators will use that against a young person just to cause that confusion in their mind as well. So, you know, like, we mustn't ever underestimate the manipulation of people that pose a risk as well, because that they, you know, like, have this way, and it's all obviously all part of the grooming process as well, of twisting things and making young people struggle to think about what it is that they actually really believe. And not just with sexuality either, with lots of different areas within their life. But I just think it's, you know, like, worth pointing that out as well.
Absolutely. Josh, I believe you have another question to ask.
Yes, I did. So we have kind of really spoken a bit of like how you spot child sexual exploitation, like by manipulation or, you know, things of that nature. But what are the more uncommon ways that you see child sexual exploitation?
So I'd like to give you a rundown on, you know, spotting the signs of. So if you have a friend and they're displaying, you know, certain characteristics that have changed. So be it, for example, that your friend may be quite reserved, and all of a sudden they are quite jumpy, or they're quite volatile, or, you know, it's an extreme mood change. So they could be a person that's, you know, high energy. All of a sudden they're being very reserved, very, you know, secretive, keeping things to themselves. You know, another indication is, you know, pregnancies, multiple pregnancies, miscarriages as well. And it was pointed out to me earlier today, you know, that in the colleges they have a card where you can get condoms and stuff. So, you know, if that person is actually, you know, they're sourcing out to get more than, you know, what would normally be like a supply of a couple of weeks, they're replenishing that after, you know, a couple of days. Those are things that, you know, I have a saying, coming out sideways. So, you know, when a young person's being sexually exploited, that trauma in itself, it's a very hard, difficult emotion to deal with, even as an adult, let alone a child. So I call it coming out sideways. So there might be bursts of anger, you know, there might, moods will be up and down. They could possibly start self-harming. You know, there could be marks on them, you know, bruising, all that kind of stuff, you know, and the befriending, gifts, you know, giving of gifts, that person, you know, going off with strange people that you don't know that they have as friends. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, I know that we don't have very much time, but there is, you know, lots and lots of stuff, you know, frequently appointments to, you know, places like the gum clinic. You know, there's so many elements.
Did you want to add to that? No? Okay. Paul, I believe you had a question to ask.
Yeah, as we're running out of time, I was just finish it off with asking what inspired you to want to work with young people at this amazing capacity?
Lisa, me or you first?
I definitely think you should go first, Roseann.
Okay, so my inspiration for doing the job that I do is in 2018, my son was stabbed in Stopsley and he died. You know, after he died, I started, you know, I was one of those parents that actually wasn't aware of the things that were going on. And I kind of took a step back and I had to look at, you know, what was the build up to this? How did this happen? And I was able to come to the understanding that actually, you know, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, you know, that I'm going to, you know, do something really bad. You know, it's a chain of events. They're not born like that. Something has gone along. You know, I like to talk about that vicious circle of you know, a victim and, you know, a groomer, and it kind of like spins on its head. So I've been able to, you know, meet the perpetrator, a couple of the perpetrators that murdered my son, and I've come to understand that actually they faced a lot of trauma in their life, you know, and it didn't just happen. Things in their life happened. They have trauma that they now have to deal with in regards to murdering somebody. So for me, it's really personal, and I know it's personal for Lisa. We have a passion for this, you know. I want to make a difference. For me, it is about sharing the knowledge that unfortunately my trauma has given me, and sharing it with young people, with parents, with professionals, in the hope that I can safeguard another young person or help another family.
Lisa, did you want to explain why you did it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, how do you follow someone as amazing as Roseann, for starters? I'm so lucky to obviously be able to work with somebody like Roseann. I feel very blessed. But with regards to my work with young people, I've been working with young people for, I think it must be over 17 or 18 years now. It's something that I always wanted to do. I always wanted to work with young people. I wanted to try and give young people a voice, for those who didn't have someone, you know, or a trusted adult within their lives that they could work with or talk to. I like to feel like the roles that I've been in, including obviously working within the Violence and Exploitation Reduction Unit, actually makes a difference. I think for anyone who's thinking about working with children, families, young people, you have to feel that you're blessed and you're lucky to be in those situations where you actually work with young people who want to, you know, work with you. It's definitely, you know, safeguarding is something that I've always been passionate about. It is something that I think a lot more people need to do to ensure that children and young people are safeguarded. And most importantly, I really want to make sure that, you know, there is enough interventions out there to prevent this from happening to children and young people.
And that brings us to the end. Thank you all for those who talked here today, and thank you to those listening at home. All of our discussions can be found on the VERU YouTube channel. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you never miss a talk. In our next podcast, we'll be looking at young people and mental health. For more information and advice, visit the VERU website at bedsveru.org or email veru@bedfordshire.pnn.police.uk.
I'm trying my best, but I'm broken inside. You can see my smile, but I have tears hanging in my eyes. I want to fill the empty space inside me, to vent the emotion before they break me. I just want someone to give me a hand, to save me before I fall. Can you hear the voice inside my heart saying I just don't want to be lonely? Hear my voice, Bedfordshire.